Hi there, welcome to the video. We're going to be looking at the control of glucose today. So first of all, it's a type of homeostasis because it's a type of maintaining a constant internal environment. So we need to know about keeping the constant temperature, the constant water levels using our kidneys, and the constant glucose levels. And the normal level that we're trying to maintain at is called the norm or the set point. Now, obviously, sometimes the blood glucose level might go too high, and negative feedback will bring it back to the norm. And sometimes our blood glucose level might go too low, and negative feedback will bring it back to the norm. So remember the word negative feedback. So that means that whenever some kind of variable deviates away from the norm where it should be, some kind of effectors bring it back to the normal. So if the blood glucose level rises, above the set point, above the norm, the cells that detect that it's too high and therefore bring it back down are some cells in the pancreas. Okay, so they're obviously called receptors, which is always the first point of negative feedback, and they're in the pancreas. Now, the ones that detect when your blood sugar level is too high are called beta cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. Okay, so it's beta cells, and I'll just pop down here. We've got some cells called alpha and beta. I'll talk about alpha in a minute. Cells are found in the islets of Langerhans, which is a group of cells in the pancreas. We've talked about the pancreas in digestion, making the enzymes, but they also make these hormones. Okay, so blood glucose rises is detected by some receptors in the pancreas on the beta cells, and then that goes to the control center, which then sends it to the effectors, which cause a response. So the effectors that cause some kind of response are these glands, these beta cells in the pancreas as well. And what they do is they release a hormone called insulin, which I'm sure you've heard of. And then the insulin causes the blood glucose level to come back down, back to the norm. Now, if the opposite happens, let's draw it in a different colour. So if your blood glucose, instead of rises, instead it falls, then that's obviously picked up by some receptors. We'll notice that it's too low. Again, the message needs to be coordinated by the pancreas, but this time it's the alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans. And then the effectors in those alpha cells are going to release a different hormone. So if it's too high, it releases the hormone insulin. If it's too low, it releases a hormone called glucagon. Okay, and the hormone glucagon causes the blood glucose level to rise up again, back to the normal. So we really need to know that when our blood glucose is too high, the beta cells release insulin to bring it back down. And when our blood glucose falls, the alpha cells release glucagon to bring it back to the norm. And that's called negative feedback. So let's look a little bit more at what happens here. So when our blood glucose levels are too high, what happens is that this is detected by receptors. So stage 1 is the receptors detect that it's too high. Okay, and these receptors are in, you can either write beta like this or you can write like beta like this. Beta cells in the islets of Langerhans, which are in the pancreas. And then the effect of that, well, it would go to a control centre, but we don't need to know about the control centre for this one. But we'll just put that because then every time we do homeostasis, we do receptors, control centre, effectors. Then it just keeps the pattern the same. So then the effectors cause a release of insulin into the blood. Now, the insulin then binds to receptors on the muscle and on the liver. And ultimately, this needs to reduce the amount of glucose in the blood. So, sorry, does that say 100%? Let's go back to the pen and see if that disappears. So ultimately, we want to decrease the amount of glucose. So ultimately, it decreases the glucose in the blood. And the way it does that is that it basically takes up the glucose from the blood to somewhere else so that it's not in the blood anymore. So when we take up glucose, we join the glucose molecules together into glycogen. So glucose molecules like this, and we join them together to make our glycogen, which is long chains of glucose molecules. It has branches as well, and it's coiled, you might remember, but we call that glycogen. Zoom out a bit, make myself a bit more space. Oops. Remove all of this. Don't know why it says 80% and stuff all over the place now. Ah, what's it doing? Oh dear. Don't know what it's doing anyway. So decreases the glucose in the blood, okay, by converting. So the first way that it does that, what that picture shows, is that it absorbs the glucose into the muscle and liver cells. And joins the glucose molecules to make glycogen. And that's how we store glucose, as glycogen. Okay. Now there is an extra fancy word for that. Because we're making glycogen, it's called glycogen. And then it's joined to the word genesis. Genesis means making something new. So glycogenesis, okay, it just means making new glycogen. Now, if we've got too much glycogen, some of that glycogen can actually also get converted into fat for storage as well. So that shows us why if we eat too much sugar, we store our extra sugar as glycogen, but also sometimes we convert that to fat. So sometimes even by eating extra sugar, we can gain fat on our body. Now, the opposite of that is obviously if the blood glucose levels are too low. So then it's going to basically do the opposite, but the name of the hormone is different. Okay, so this time the receptors that detect it aren't the alpha cells, they're the beta cells. Oh, sorry, they're the alpha cells. It was beta cells last time. So alpha, you can write out like that. So it's the alpha cells in the same place. So they're on the islets of Langerhans, which are in the pancreas. Okay, then it would go to a control centre, but we don't need to know any detail for this topic. And then it would go to an effector, and the effector is the same place. It's still the alpha cells on the islets of Langerhans. And the difference here is rather than releasing insulin, it releases the hormone glucagon. So it's a different hormone. And the glucagon needs to do the opposite. Okay, so rather than decreasing the blood glucose level, it needs to ultimately increase the blood glucose. So where earlier we might have stored our glucose as glycogen, we now need to break that glycogen back down. Okay, so the glucagon binds to the liver cells. It doesn't bind to muscle cells this time, it's just liver cells. And by binding to the liver cells, the liver breaks down the glycogen and turns it back into glucose. And that's released back into the blood, and the blood levels will then rise back to normal. Now, like the other one, it has a fancy name. So this time it's called glycogen. Glycogen olysis. Lysis means to break down, doesn't it? So glycogen olysis. Glycogen is being broken down. Now, it can also make some new glucose. Okay, so the effector can also make new glucose. So rather than glucose that we've stored, it can actually make glucose afresh from the resources in our body, and that's called gluconeogenesis. Okay, gluconeogenesis, making new glucose as well. So ultimately, we just need to be aware of what causes the changes to keep the glucose level constant. So we want it to be at the norm. Okay, if it goes too high, the hormone responsible is insulin. Okay, which comes from the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. If it goes too low, the hormone is glucagon, and that's released by the alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. Either way, it's just trying to bring it back to the norm, back to this set point of what it's meant to be. Now, in some people, this system doesn't work properly, and those people suffer from diabetes. Now, diabetes is a shortened version of the real name. It's actually called diabetes mellitus. Okay, that's the full name for diabetes. And it just means that you can't regulate your blood glucose levels properly. You can't do it correctly. And there's two types of diabetes. We've got type 1 and type 2. Okay. Now, if you thought you might have diabetes, you would have a certain set of symptoms that you were looking out for. So the first symptom is weight loss. So because you haven't got enough insulin, the cells basically don't get enough glucose ultimately, so you lose weight. You feel thirsty all the time. That's a real telltale sign that you feel thirsty. You've basically got too much glucose in the blood, so you can't get it into the cells to help gain weight. It's just stuck in the blood, and if you've got lots of glucose in the blood, then the concentration of water in the blood is actually less, and that's what makes you feel thirsty. If you can't get the glucose into your cells for respiration, you're going to have a real lack of energy if you can't respire as much. So you're going to feel tired, and your body will actually crave sweet food because your body thinks it needs glucose. You've got the glucose, it's just that it's stuck in your blood. You can't get it into the cells. So you crave glucose. Okay, and if they did a urine test, they would find lots of glucose in the urine. Okay, so that if you went to the doctors and said, I think I might have diabetes, these are my symptoms, the first thing they'd do is a urine test, and they'd find glucose in the urine that shouldn't be there. You should be absorbing extra glucose into your cells and storing it as glycogen. You shouldn't be excreting extra glucose in your urine. So type 1 diabetes is usually diagnosed when you're really young. It can be called insulin-dependent diabetes or juvenile onset diabetes. But basically what happens is that your own immune system is the problem. And what your immune system does is it attacks those beta cells that are meant to make the insulin. Okay, so then you can't make insulin. So it's nothing to do with your lifestyle or anything. It's just if you're unlucky to have it. Okay, so you're going to end up with really high blood glucose levels because you can't make insulin, so you can't store it in the liver as glycogen. Okay, if you have this, then you have to be really, really careful with your diet because you don't want to make your blood glucose go up and down too much. You need to try and keep it constant as you can. And then you have to have insulin injections. And to know how much insulin to give yourself, you have to take little blood tests. Okay. Um, Type 2 diabetes is usually diagnosed when you're an adult. So this is called juvenile, which means as a child, and this is known as the sort of adult one. It's usually diagnosed when you're an adult. And it's insulin dependent or late onset diabetes. You're still making insulin from the beta cells, but your receptors aren't working. So the receptors can't detect the insulin. So you have got insulin, but your receptors can't detect the insulin, and therefore the insulin doesn't do its job. Okay, so people with type 2 diabetes have to control it with diet and exercise. Okay, we don't use injections as much. It's mostly due to diet and exercise to control it. Okay, but there is some strong evidence that your chance of getting type 2 diabetes is increased by obesity and high sugar diets. Whereas type 1, you can't help it that you get it as a child, and there's nothing you can really do about it. Whereas type 2, we can avoid it if we have a really healthy diet. Now, there's another word that I just want to make sure I've been over, which is hyperglycemia. So we've looked at the words hyper and hypo quite a bit in this course. So hyper always means high. So hyperglycemia means that you've got high glucose levels in the blood. Okay, and we've talked a little bit about the symptoms because it's the same as the symptoms as having diabetes. Because if you've got diabetes, you tend to get hyperglycemia. So you feel thirsty, you wee a lot, you've got a headache, blurred vision, tiredness, it's hard to concentrate. And having high blood glucose levels over a long period of time can actually damage your organs and tissues. It can be really dangerous. Okay. Ultimately, long term, this is really tragic. It can actually lead to things like your toes and your fingers, which are your extremities, having to be amputated. Okay, really severe cases. It can damage your nerves, kidneys, and also your eyesight. Okay, so if you do have diabetes, it's really important that it's diagnosed and treated because hyperglycemia over a long period of time is really, really bad for you.